Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're taking you way back in time, like 2,500 years, to explore the Book of Haggai. It's a short but powerful book in the Old Testament, and our source material today are excerpts from it. Now, picture this. It's 520 BC, and the Jewish people have finally returned to Jerusalem after decades of exile in Babylon. They're ready to rebuild their lives, their city, and most importantly, their temple. But they find it in ruins.
You can almost feel the weight of that disappointment, the shattered hopes, like returning home after a natural disaster only to find everything you knew and loved reduced to rubble. But that's where the prophet Haggai enters the scene. He doesn't mince words, delivering God's message directly to the people, and it's a message that cuts right to the chase, questioning their priorities.
Yeah, he really calls them out, doesn't he? He points out that they're living comfortably in their paneled houses while God's house lies in ruins. I mean, that detail about the paneling really stuck with me. It paints a picture of their comfort, maybe even complacency, while the temple is neglected.
It's a stark contrast, and it speaks volumes about their spiritual state. They've allowed the rebuilding of the temple to stall, focusing on their own comfort and security. It's a classic case of putting our own needs before our commitment to something bigger than ourselves.
That makes me think about how easy it is to get caught up in our own lives. It's like choosing to spend hours scrolling social media instead of nurturing our relationships or pursuing our passions. We end up feeling empty because we've neglected what truly matters.
That's a brilliant analogy. And Haggai doesn't stop there. He goes on to connect their personal hardships, like poor harvests and economic struggles, to their neglect of the temple.
It's like they're experiencing real-life consequences for their misplaced priorities. It reminds me of those parables where the characters face hardship because they've strayed from the right path.
Exactly. And that's where things get really interesting. Haggai isn't just scolding them. He's offering them a way back, a call to action. He urges them to return to God and rebuild the temple.
Okay, so it's not all doom and gloom. There's a glimmer of hope here. It's almost like a wake-up call urging them to reevaluate their priorities and get back on track.
Absolutely. And his instructions are very specific and practical. Go up to the hills, get timber, and rebuild. It's a no-nonsense approach. And he reassures them that God will be with them every step of the way, blessing their efforts.
No, that's encouraging. And what's amazing is that the people actually listened. Zerubbabel, the governor, Joshua, the high priest, and the whole community rallied together.
It's truly remarkable. They've put aside their personal comforts and distractions and come together with a renewed sense of purpose. Just a few weeks after Haggai's first message, they're back at work on the temple, demonstrating the power of collective action and a shared commitment to something greater than themselves.
That's truly inspiring. But then Haggai delivers another message, and this one focuses on the future glory of this second temple. And get this, he compares it to Solomon's magnificent temple. Now, for those who had seen the first temple in all its grandeur, this new one must have seemed like a pale imitation.
You can imagine the skepticism. How could this new temple possibly compare to the splendor of Solomon's temple? But here's the twist. God promises that the glory of this second temple will surpass even that of the first.
Wait, really? A smaller, simpler temple surpassing the magnificence of the first? How is that even possible?
That's the point. It's not about outward appearances or grandeur. Haggai uses vivid imagery, speaking of nations being shaken, treasures pouring in from all corners of the world. It's a glimpse into a future where all nations will come to worship God in Jerusalem. It's about the spiritual significance, not the physical structure.
I see where you're going with this. It's like saying, don't judge a book by its cover, right? This seemingly less impressive temple becomes a powerful symbol of a future filled with hope and God's presence.
Precisely. The second temple, while humble in comparison to the first, becomes a beacon of something much greater, a testament to God's enduring presence and power. But just when you think you've grasped the message, Haggai throws in a bit of a curveball. He starts talking to the priests about ritual purity, using what I like to call the holy meat riddle.
Okay, a riddle. I'm intrigued. What's the riddle, and why is Haggai suddenly quizzing the priests about food?
He asks them, if holy meat touches bread, does the bread become holy? But what if an unclean person touches it? It's a thought-provoking question designed to make them consider the nature of holiness and impurity.
I can see how that would get them thinking. So what's the answer? What's the deeper meaning behind this riddle?
The priests correctly answer that the bread doesn't become holy just by touching holy meat, but it does become unclean if touched by someone who is ritually impure. And that's where Haggai's point comes in.
Okay, so it's not just a random food quiz. There's a deeper connection here to the people's situation, right?
Exactly. He's using this riddle to highlight how their association with pagan practices and their own internal struggles are affecting their purity and, by extension, their offerings to God. They're so focused on the physical rebuilding of the temple that they've overlooked the internal work, the purification of their hearts.
So it's not just about constructing a building, it's about ensuring that what happens within those walls is pure and aligned with God's will. It's about inner transformation as much as outward action.
You've hit the nail on the head. And as always, Haggai offers a message of hope. He reassures them that once they recommit to God and cleanse themselves from these influences, they will experience his blessings in abundance. But there's one final message that truly drives home the overarching theme of Haggai's prophecy. This time, God focuses on Zerubbabel, the governor who's been leading the rebuilding efforts.
Now that we understand Haggai's initial call to action and how the people responded, let's explore this final message. It sounds like Zerubbabel plays a key role in all of this. What does Haggai have to say about him?
God calls Zerubbabel my servant, a title laden with significance, and then he compares him to a signet ring.
A signet ring, that's a powerful image, but I'm not sure I understand the connection. What's the significance of a signet ring in this context?
Well, in ancient times, a signet ring was a symbol of authority, often worn by kings and rulers. It was used to seal documents signifying authenticity and power. By calling Zerubbabel a signet ring, God affirms his chosen status, the authority he has been given to lead the people, and the authenticity of his leadership.
So it's not just about rebuilding a temple, it's about restoring leadership and authority, setting things right in a much broader sense.
That's a great observation. And there's another layer of meaning that some scholars believe points beyond Zerubbabel to a future messianic figure, a figure who would ultimately embody the authority and leadership needed to fulfill God's plan for his people.
Wow, that's a lot to unpack. This seemingly small, localized message about rebuilding a temple becomes a window into something much bigger, a hint at the coming Messiah.
That's the beauty of Haggai. It's a short book, but it's packed with layers of meaning. It speaks to the importance of priorities, the consequences of neglecting our relationship with God, the hope of future restoration and blessing, and the coming of a Messiah who will usher in a new era. But what makes Haggai truly fascinating is its relevance for us today, even thousands of years later.
Okay, that's what I was just thinking about. We may not be rebuilding a physical temple, but what does Haggai's message mean for us in the 21st century? What temples are we neglecting in our own lives?
That's the question each of us needs to wrestle with. What have we allowed to fall into disrepair while we're busy building our own metaphorical paneled houses? Is it our spiritual lives, our relationships, our commitment to serving others, or perhaps our commitment to truth and justice?
Some might say this call to action feels a bit harsh for our modern sensibilities. How do we reconcile this with the idea of a loving God?
It's not about harshness. It's about accountability and love. A loving parent might discipline a child not out of anger, but out of a desire to guide them toward a better path. In a similar way, God, through Haggai, is calling us back to what truly matters, not to punish us, but to lead us towards a more fulfilling life.
That makes sense. It's a reminder that sometimes we need a little shake-up, a wake-up call to reevaluate our priorities and get back on track. But what does that return to God look like in our modern context? It's not like we can all just pick up hammers and start rebuilding a physical temple.
True, but the essence of the message remains the same. It's about recognizing where we've fallen short and making a conscious effort to realign our lives with God's will. This could involve deepening our spiritual practices, reconnecting with our faith communities, making time for prayer and reflection, or simply choosing to live in a way that honors God's values.
So it's about aligning our actions with our beliefs, putting God first, not just in our words, but in the way we live our lives.
Exactly. And just as the people of Jerusalem experienced a renewed sense of purpose and energy when they rededicated themselves to the temple, we too can experience a transformation in our lives when we put God at the center. But it's important to remember that the concept of uncleanliness that Haggai talks about isn't just about ritual purity. It also has a deeper symbolic meaning.
That's what I was curious about earlier when we talked about the holy meat riddle. How does the idea of ritual impurity translate to our lives today? What are the modern-day equivalents of those pagan practices that Haggai warns against?
Think about it this way. Just as contact with certain things could make someone ritually unclean in ancient times, there are things in our modern world that can contaminate our hearts and minds, hindering our spiritual growth.
And so what are some examples of these modern-day impurities?
It could be anything that pulls us away from God and leads us down a path of negativity or destruction. It could be harmful ideologies, toxic relationships, addictive behaviors, or even an obsession with material possessions.
It's about recognizing those influences and making a conscious effort to purify our hearts and minds to align ourselves with what is good and life-giving.
You got it. It's about that inner work, the ongoing process of self-reflection and purification that allows us to become more receptive to God's presence in our lives. And that's where the true blessings lie. Remember how Haggai talked about the people experiencing abundant blessings once they recommitted to God?
Yes, he promised them overflowing storehouses and prosperity. But are those blessings limited to material wealth? Or do they encompass something more?
While material blessings are certainly part of the picture, Haggai's message points to something deeper. He's talking about a wholeness, a sense of peace and purpose that comes from aligning ourselves with God's will. It's about experiencing the fullness of life that God intends for us.
So it's not just about getting rich or having a comfortable life. It's about finding true meaning and purpose in our connection with something larger than ourselves.
You've summed it up perfectly. And this brings us back to that intriguing connection between Zerubbabel and the messianic figure. You see, Haggai's message isn't just about rebuilding a temple in the 6th century BC. It's about laying the foundation for something much grander, a spiritual restoration that will culminate in the coming of the Messiah.
And for those of us who are living in a world that's already experienced the coming of Jesus, how do we understand this prophecy? What does it mean for us today?
That's a great question. It challenges us to consider how we see Jesus in light of Haggai's prophecy. Is he simply a historical figure, or is he the living embodiment of God's chosen servant, the signet ring that signifies God's authority and love?
And if he is that signet ring, that symbol of God's presence and power, how does that impact our lives today? Does it change the way we view ourselves, our purpose, our relationship with God?
It certainly should. It means that we are no longer living in a time of waiting for God's promises to be fulfilled. We are living in a time of actively participating in those promises of being instruments of God's love and grace in the world. But just like the people in Haggai's time faced challenges and distractions, we too encounter obstacles in our journey of faith.
So how do we navigate those challenges and remain focused on what truly matters? How do we keep from getting bogged down by the busyness of life and losing sight of our spiritual priorities?
That's where the lessons of Haggai become so valuable.
It sounds like Haggai's message is like a blueprint, not just for rebuilding a physical temple, but for rebuilding our lives, our communities, our world in a way that aligns with God's purpose.
That's a beautiful way to put it. It's about recognizing that the work of spiritual restoration is ongoing, a continuous process of building and refining, both individually and collectively.
So how do we practically apply these principles to our everyday lives?
Well, it starts with those small daily choices, those seemingly insignificant acts that, when woven together, create a tapestry of a life lived in alignment with God's will. It's about choosing to prioritize our relationship with God, to extend kindness to those around us, to invest our time and energy in things that matter.
It's like building a life that reflects God's heart brick by brick, day by day. Not a grand sweeping gesture, but a series of thoughtful, intentional choices.
Precisely. And that's where the true challenge lies. It's so easy to get caught up in the busyness of life, to let distractions pull us away from our priorities. But remember those consequences that Haggai talked about.
Yeah, the poor harvest, the economic struggle, the sense of emptiness and lack of purpose. Those consequences weren't just physical, they were also spiritual and emotional.
Exactly. And those same consequences can manifest in our lives today, even if they take on a different form. When we neglect our spiritual well-being, when we allow our priorities to become misaligned, we experience a disconnect from God, a sense of unease, a lack of fulfillment.
It's like we're trying to build a house on a shaky foundation. No matter how beautiful the structure might appear on the surface, it's ultimately unstable.
That's a powerful analogy. And that's why Haggai's message is so important. It's a reminder that we need to invest in that spiritual foundation to make sure that our lives are built on a solid rock, rooted in our connection with God.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into Haggai, let's leave our listeners with this final thought. If Haggai were speaking to us today, what temple would he urge us to rebuild?
That's the question each of us needs to ask ourselves. What area of our lives needs our immediate attention and dedication? Is it our relationship with God, our relationships with others, our commitment to justice and compassion? The answer will be different for each of us, but the call to action remains the same.
It's a call to reevaluate our priorities, to examine our hearts, and to make those necessary adjustments that will lead us towards a more fulfilling and purpose-driven life. And remember, the glory of that second temple paled in comparison to the glory that God has in store for us both now and in the future. We simply need to open ourselves to that possibility, to embrace the challenge of rebuilding and renewal.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Haggai. It's been an enlightening journey, and we hope you'll take these insights with you as you continue to explore your own path of faith and growth.